A quiet evening in Atlanta turned into horror when Officer Mark Reynolds opened fire on Breonna Johnson, an unarmed nurse returning home from work. Known in the neighborhood for his arrogance and cold suspicion, his actions pushed the community's anger to the breaking point. But what Reynolds didn't know was that Breonna's brother, Daniel, a Delta Force sniper, had just arrived. And only listen to how this shocking confrontation unfolded and why, in the end, justice finally prevailed. The city of Atlanta was winding down. Streetlights hummed, casting their amber glow on quiet suburban roads. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of music drifted from a passing car, mingling with the rhythmic chorus of crickets. For most, it was an ordinary evening, the kind where people closed their blinds, locked their doors, and exhaled after a long day. For Breonna Johnson, this night was supposed to be no different. She had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, tending to patients with the patience only a seasoned nurse could carry. Her shoulders ached, her eyes burned, and all she wanted was the sanctuary of home, a shower, a meal, and the warmth of her bed. As she turned into her neighborhood, a small row of houses where every face was familiar, she allowed herself to relax. The street was usually alive with the laughter of children riding bikes or the soft chatter of neighbors leaning on fences. But tonight, it was still, almost too still. Then came the lights. Red, blue. They flared suddenly in her rearview mirror, splashing her tired face with their dizzying colors. Her stomach dropped. The flashing sirens filled her car's interior, bouncing off the windshield, forcing her pulse to quicken. She hadn't been speeding, she hadn't rolled through a stop, there was no reason for this, and yet, here she was, alone, boxed in by power she didn't ask for. Breonna pulled over instinctively, her hands steady on the wheel, though her heart pounded. She took a breath, whispering to herself the reminders she had been told her whole life. Stay calm, be respectful, do what they say. The patrol car door opened with a thud. Out stepped Officer Mark Reynolds. His figure was unmistakable, broad shoulders, square jaw, the kind of walk that broadcast authority. But to this neighborhood, he was not a protector. He was a shadow. For years, residents had spoken in hushed tones about his presence. Too quick to escalate, too eager to dominate. His reputation was a storm cloud that followed wherever he patrolled. And tonight, that storm was aimed at Breonna. He approached slowly, his hand already resting on his holster, a gesture not of caution, but of certainty. His eyes, cold and unblinking, studied her not as a person, but as a target. Breonna rolled her window down halfway, her voice quiet, uncertain. "Officer, is everything all right?" Her question hung in the air like a fragile thread, but Reynolds didn't answer. Instead, the silence was broken by the chilling scrape of metal, the unmistakable sound of a weapon being drawn. Time slowed. The muzzle lifted. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a crack split the night. Breonna cried out, clutching her arm as fire lanced across her skin. The round had grazed her, missing her heart by inches. Her car door rattled from the impact. For a moment, the neighborhood was paralyzed. Porch lights flickered on, doors creaked open, curtains shifted. Mothers grabbed their children, pulling them back inside. Fathers stepped out in disbelief, phones already in hand, recording what their eyes could barely process. A uniformed officer had just fired at an unarmed woman sitting in her own car in her own neighborhood. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nobody dared to move. Nobody dared to speak. The weight of the act pressed down on everyone like a storm about to break. And then came the single, collective emotion, raw and undeniable. The sound of the shot still hung in the air when the neighborhood erupted. A scream pierced the silence, Breonna's neighbor rushing out from her porch, her hands covering her mouth. Another voice shouted, "She's hurt!" And suddenly the stillness of the block fractured into chaos. Phones lit up the night as residents began recording, their lenses locked on the officer who now stood in the center of it all. Officer Mark Reynolds spun around sharply, barking at the crowd. "Stay back! Don't interfere!" His voice was sharp, not protective, but commanding, a warning to silence anyone who dared question him. His eyes darted across the street, not with guilt or hesitation, but with the icy confidence of someone who believed his uniform was untouchable. Brianna sat trembling in her seat, one hand pressed against her arm, her breaths shallow and uneven. She looked around desperately, her gaze searching for something, someone to assure her she wasn't alone. And she wasn't. Dozens of eyes were fixed on Reynolds, eyes that had seen him patrol these streets with the same cold stare, eyes that remembered the heavy spotlight of his cruiser on late walks home, eyes that remembered his sharp tone, the suspicion he carried into every encounter. And now, all of those memories bled together into one raw emotion: hatred. Neighbors shouted over one another, their voices quaking with disbelief and fury. "She did nothing! Why would you do that? She's a nurse! She just came home from work!" But Reynolds didn't flinch. He muttered something about a possible threat, his words stumbling out as if even he didn't believe them. His explanation fell flat, swallowed by the rising anger of the community. The man who had been feared for years now stood exposed under the glare of porch lights and phone cameras. His arrogance, once hidden behind authority, was now on full display. He adjusted his stance, scanning the crowd with an expression that was less concern and more annoyance, as if this was nothing more than another shift, another routine show of force. For the people watching, it was the breaking point. They had lived under his intimidation. They had swallowed their frustration, hoping it would never come to this. But tonight, the line had been crossed. A woman they knew, someone who had devoted her life to helping others, had been struck down in front of them. And in that moment, the neighborhood's fear transformed into something far more dangerous to Reynolds than resistance. It transformed into hatred. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the woman trembling in her car was not alone in this fight, because her brother, the man who had protected his country in silence and shadows, was on his way home. And when he arrived, the balance of power on that street would never be the same. The neighborhood was still buzzing with shouts when the sound of a car door closing cut through the noise. Heads turned. A tall figure stepped onto the pavement, his stride steady, his face unreadable. Daniel Johnson had arrived. To the neighbors, he was simply Brianna's older brother, the one who had left years ago and returned only on rare occasions. Few knew where he had been or what he had done. He never spoke much about it. He didn't have to. His presence carried a weight that words couldn't capture. But to the U.S. military, his story was written in silence and shadows. Daniel was Delta Force, the kind of soldier called upon when the mission was too dangerous for anyone else. He had spent years in unforgiving deserts, dense forests, and jagged mountains, facing threats most people only read in classified reports. His skill with a rifle had saved lives overseas. Tonight, it would save one at home. As he stepped closer, the crowd instinctively gave way. The noise of outrage softened, replaced by a quiet anticipation. Something was about to change. Daniel's eyes found his sister. Brianna sat trembling, her hand pressed to her arm, her face pale but defiant. The sight hit him harder than any battlefield ever had. His protective instinct surged. Then his gaze shifted, locking on the man still holding his weapon as if nothing had happened. Officer Reynolds stood smugly, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes scanning the crowd as if daring anyone to challenge him. He hadn't lowered his weapon. To him, this was still his scene, his control, his rules. But Daniel saw it differently. What rose in him wasn't reckless fury. It wasn't the blind rage of a man out of control. It was sharper, colder, the focused anger of someone trained to channel emotion into precision. His breathing slowed, his pulse steadied, and his mind narrowed onto one fact. This man had hurt his sister. The officer noticed him now, this calm figure cutting through the crowd. "And who were you supposed to be?" Reynolds sneered. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the weight of steel. He stepped closer, his tone low but sharp enough to cut through the humid Georgia night. "You fired at the wrong person tonight." The crowd hushed. For the first time all evening, Reynolds' expression flickered, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his face. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone on that street felt it. For a heartbeat, the street stood frozen in silence, two men facing each other under the heavy glow of porch lights. Officer Reynolds let out a sharp, mocking laugh, as if trying to brush away the weight of the moment. His hand twitched toward his holster once again, clinging to the only power he had ever known. The crowd gasped, bracing for the worst. But Daniel moved first. Not recklessly, not wildly, with the speed and precision of a man who had trained his entire life for moments like this. His body lowered, his stance locked, and his eyes, sharp, unblinking, bore into Reynolds with a command that required no words. It wasn't just strength on display, it was mastery. The officer faltered, his confidence cracked. The same arrogance that once fueled him now collapsed under the weight of Daniel's controlled fury. He reached for his weapon, but his motion was clumsy, desperate. Daniel closed the distance in an instant, his movements smooth, decisive, unrelenting. And then, in front of the neighbors who had lived too long in fear, the impossible happened. Reynolds was no longer the figure of power. His weapon slipped from his grasp. Daniel's hand, firm and unshakable, forced him downward. The officer hit the ground, his authority shattered in an instant. Within seconds he was pinned, not harmed, but utterly powerless. The crowd erupted, phones capturing every second, ensuring the truth could never be buried. What Reynolds had once used to intimidate, his badge, his presence, his uniform, now lay stripped of meaning. Against Daniel, none of it mattered. Brianna, trembling but safe, stepped from her car. Her brother reached out, steadying her with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the force he had just unleashed. Their hands clasped tightly, a silent promise that she was no longer alone and never would be again. Then came the sound the community had waited years to hear, sirens in the distance, this time not to protect Reynolds, but to take him away. The neighbors, who once whispered in fear when his car patrolled their block, now cheered openly. Relief, joy, and vindication filled the night air. For the first time, the street felt free. And as Daniel stood tall beside his sister, the truth was undeniable. The badge no longer shielded arrogance. Justice had arrived, not in the form of violence, but in the unwavering presence of a brother who refused to let fear win. It was more than victory. It was closure. It was satisfaction.